Chapter 21 I'm so hot you are listening at novelfull.audio. After school, Alan hurried home, masturbated, took a nap, and then woke up and masturbated again. This was becoming his daily routine, and it served to provide 2 dependable check marks on his chart that tracked of the 6 times he needed to come each day. He'd also masturbated once in the morning. Each time, he mostly thought about Suzanne, each time trying to push lustful thoughts of his sister and mother out of his head. He was a bit more successful with that this time, mostly because dreaming of Suzanne visiting him again was more than enough fodder for his fantasy. Just after he finished masturbating twice in a row, the object of his latest fantasies knocked on his door. This time, Suzanne was smarter about her arrival than she'd been the previous time. Rather than come in before he'd masturbated, she decided it was better to come in immediately afterwards. That would make it harder to get him aroused, but it also meant that he could stay hard a lot longer. Besides, she didn't figure getting him hard again would be much of a problem, not with her looks. She actually waited outside with an ear and a cup to his door until she heard the quiet noises from his bed finally stop. Then she knocked. "Sweetie. It's your Aunt Susie." "Come in," yelled Alan. He had thrown on a T-shirt and shorts, again with no underwear, but this time he did so deliberately in the hopes that she would grace him with another visit. He was sitting up in his bed, pretending to read a science fiction novel, trying to act casual. But in fact, his heart had started pounding with excitement the moment he'd heard her voice. He thought she'd be wearing the same outfit that she'd had on earlier, which he was eagerly looking forward to seeing again. But to his surprise, she was wearing something even sexier. She now wore a skimpy summer dress that was partly see-through. Or perhaps it was lingerie, he wasn't sure. His heart beat even faster. "Oh man. Sweet. I just know something good is gonna happen." Suzanne walked right over to his bed and said, "I thought we could do more of what we did the day before yesterday. I've got some more internet porn to show you. Does that sound like fun?" "Very," he said enthusiastically. He was somewhat skittish, but more confident than the nervous wreck he'd been 2 days earlier since he had a better sense of what would happen. "Great. But why the dungeon look to your room? I thought you were over your depression." The heavy drapes were drawn, making the room nearly dark as night. Alan tried to think. He didn't want to open the drapes because he was hoping the same lighting effect from the lamp would allow him to glimpse the reflections of her breasts again, but of course he couldn't say that. So instead he claimed, "I just woke up from a nap, and when I open the drapes it hurts my eyes. Besides, it keeps the room cool. It's so hot lately." "Just wondering," she said. With the double meaning evident in her voice, she noted, "Things are getting pretty hot." More playfully, she added, "Although I was rather hoping you'd claim to be a vampire who wanted to bite my neck." Her comment went unnoticed because he realized that he had a problem. His dick was already hard as iron, sticking out through the zipper fly of his tight short shorts. To stuff it back into the shorts would be like putting an elephant into a bread box. He wanted to look at the porn with his erection secretly hanging out, as he had done during her prior visit. That had made things a lot more fun and a lot less painful than they otherwise would have been. But now he was sitting on his bed with his dick under the covers, rather than in front of the computer. "How can I get from here to there without her noticing?" "Maybe it's better if you open them a crack," he suggested, hoping the same lighting effect would again allow him to glimpse the reflection of her breasts. "Okay. I take it you mean the drapes and not my clothes," she responded playfully, not that her clothes had any cracks to open, as they were already barely clinging to her body. When she faced away from him and walked towards the window a few feet away, he leapt from his bed and made it to his computer chair in record time. He immediately scooted the chair forward as much as he could, to make sure his exposed erection went far under the desk just as it had during her previous visit, then reached up to turn on the desk lamp. However, the lightning-fast action of a supposedly sleepy boy immediately roused Suzanne's suspicion. She took a good look at him from across the room. At first she couldn't see much of anything, as his back was now turned to her, but as she walked closer towards his desk she found an angle that showed his exposed hard dot on. Oh joy, she thought, clasping her hands together in glee. Just look at that big boy. This is going to be even more fun than I thought. How many more days will it take for my scheme to unfold before he's pounding me silly with that thing? I can't wait. She went to his stereo to put on some music. She looked at his CD collection with a frown. I don't suppose you have anything classical, do you? Ravel, maybe. It was obvious he didn't, even though he was too excited to answer. So she put on the Pretenders' second album instead. She knew that album well from her college days. She figured that with songs like Bad Boys Get Spanked and The Adulteress, it could help set a sexy mood. She sat down right at his side as she had 2 days before, and judged it time to discuss the weather some more, to open up further teasing possibilities. So you call this cool, huh? She grabbed a part of her dress that was in front of her boobs and began pulling it out and away from her cleavage, then back towards her, slowly and repeatedly, as if she were fanning herself. Each time she pulled the dress away, she completely exposed her breasts to Alan's helplessly gawking eyes. By the time she was done, she had left one boob totally naked. I don't know about you, but I'm so hot, she added. Luckily for her ploy, the air conditioning in the Plummer house wasn't working. Actually it wasn't a matter of luck, since she'd fiddled with the controls to make sure the air conditioner was temporarily broken. But she had gone further and, using the bathroom across the hall, had dabbed herself with water all over before coming to him. The effect was that her clothes were sticking to her in many places and rivulets of water were running down her skin everywhere. She looked like she was sweating profusely, as if she'd just run a long race. She finally pulled the top of the dress away from her and used one hand to keep it open, allowing him an unrestricted view of her naked boobs, glistening with dripping water. Before, he might have thought that her exposure was an accident, as it obviously had been with Susan. But she was acting so blatantly now that there could be no mistaking that what she was doing was intentional. He realized that, and was staggered by the implications. God, I've never seen anything so sexy. You are hot, he abruptly said out loud, in pure amazement. Then he blushed at his brashness. Why, sweetie, she replied coyly, are you saying I look unusually warm, or are you saying that I'm an attractive woman? Tough question, he thought. Am I allowed to call Aunt Susie hot, or did I really make a blunder? He looked at her again, with her exposed breasts just a foot from his face. He had a strong urge to simply bury his face in them. Damn, if I can't call her hot, then nothing is hot. Holy fucking Christ, she's sitting there with both boobs just out there. Damn. Both, actually. There was a long pause as he built up to say something. He finally spit it out. Aunt Susie. I should warn you that your top, well, it's kind of come undone. She beamed. She loved that he'd been honest about it. She'd never known another man who would have said that to her. Sweetie. You're just too sweet. Thanks for the warning, but don't you think I know what I'm showing? Alan was having a hard time figuring out where to look. He still couldn't believe she wouldn't mind if he stared at her chest. You mean? But, what about your husband? I have to respect your marriage. His eyes bounced back and forth from her face to her chest as he battled his lustful urges. She shook her head in disbelief, which set her twin orbs lightly swaying. Sweetie, you're too nice. Let me worry about that, okay? Let's just say that there's no love left between Eric and me. You should know that by now, don't you? He did, but he still protested, but I can't just stare at you, why not? That's the whole idea of sexing things up. He said with complete sincerity, because once I start staring, I won't be able to stop, probably not until my eyeballs fall out. You're just too beautiful. Chapter 22 I'll die before I'm 20. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Why sweetie, you say the nicest things. Suzanne delightedly reached around him and gave him a big hug, which wasn't hard to do as he was already leaning over close to her amazing rack. He felt her hardened nipples pressing firmly into his chest. Now she's touching me. Living goddess Aunt Susie is touching me. Those can't be her nipples, can they? Someone pinch me. Oh God, I'm gonna come. This is too exciting. He couldn't believe that his erection was exposed under his desk, in addition to everything else. He really did feel like he was about to come. She tried her best to get her boobs to rub against his chest without making it look too obvious. She figured she would need to take it one step at a time with him. She said, "Thank you so much. You've never complimented my looks before, you meanie. Do you really think I'm attractive?" She pulled back from her tight hug so he could get a more complete look at her, even as she remained sitting in the adjacent chair. One of her breasts still hung lewdly out of her dress. He couldn't believe his luck. This is too weird, too good. I can't possibly be this lucky. Something strange is going on. He thought nervously. I really must be in a Twilight Zone episode. Maybe the one where the guy thinks he's in heaven, but it turns out to be hell. This is all a big joke or something. Right. Yes. You're gorgeous, he finally said. Oh, sweetie. She handed up a dramatic swoon backwards for his benefit. Oh, I'm so excited. That makes looking at these naughty pictures that much more fun, don't you think? She turned to the computer and said, why don't we get started? But let's pretend I don't realize that my top is falling open. I think it'll be more fun that way. Yeah, okay, he somehow mumbled as he watched her begin typing on the keyboard. The breast closest to him still hung out, but as she leaned forward the dress fell forward as well, causing both of her huge tits to be completely exposed to his eyes. Her top did really seem to be completely falling off. Both shoulder straps were in danger of slipping down her arms, which would leave her truly topless. He wanted to stroke his exposed erection so badly he could cry, but he didn't for fear of disclosing that it was sticking out under the desk. When she finished typing the web URL, she again put her arm around him and placed her hand on his opposite shoulder. This caused one of her naked tits to press against his own uncovered arm, just below the bottom of his shirt sleeve. He could feel all the sweaty wetness from her breast on the bare skin of his arm. He cluelessly thought, I can't believe it. Is she hinting I can touch her too? No way. That would be way more than just sexing things up a little. She'd never go for that. Only in my dreams. The lamp again illuminated her in such a way that he could see the reflection of her full chest in the monitor. With her other hand she manipulated the mouse, causing naked pictures to pop up as they had 2 days earlier. The website had a generic name but, as before, it was actually the one she had created herself in the prior few days. Thus there were no advertisements or flashy graphics, just lots of picture links to click on. That way she could control exactly what he saw. She grabbed his hand and guided it over the mouse as if he'd never used a mouse before. Actually, it was just another excuse to touch him. 2 days ago I just showed you some pictures of women, but today I thought I'd show you some pictures of people together. Here, go ahead and click on any of the links. She asked, there. Doesn't that just make you hot? Using his hand, she brought up more pictures, which showed men fucking women, women on women, and much more. I know it gets me going. These pictures were much more explicit than the pin-up shots from before, although Alan didn't need the extra stimulation to get any more aroused. He was barely even aware there was a computer in front of him. He felt himself drowning in Suzanne's perfume. The previous time she had smelled like vanilla and this time he could swear she smelled vaguely like cinnamon. Whatever it was, he loved it. Using both her hands, she began caressing her body outside of her clothes while apparently staring intently at the screen. At first she did it very subtly, as if she didn't even realize what she was doing. But she gradually began moving her hands further afield, and more vigorously. I get really hot and bothered looking at these pictures, she said breathlessly. He turned his head and just stared at her instead of the naked photos. Holy cow. Look at her. Real life is so much better. One of her hands finally reached an exposed breast, but only after going seemingly everywhere else. Realizing she couldn't keep up the pretense forever that she hadn't noticed that she was hanging out all over, she looked at her boob and exclaimed with surprise, "Oh, would you look at that?" She looked at his face and said with amusement, "Looks like you already are." Then she giggled. He got really red in the face and muttered, "Sorry." "No reason to be," she came back quickly. "Your mother, your sister, and I are trying to get you horny so you can jack off more often. Something like an exposed boob or two can only help, right? You don't mind, do you?" "Mind?" he asked incredulously. "No, that's cool," he said in an unsuccessful attempt to brush it off like he was cool and didn't care one way or another. As if this kind of thing happens all the time. Not. "Does it get you excited?" she asked, obviously excited herself. He said, yeah, but he was too embarrassed to look her in the eye while admitting that, so he averted his gaze. "Well, if that's the case," she said, "maybe I'll just leave them hanging out for a while then. In fact, maybe I'll just open this dress up a bit more. That might help you out even more." She pushed a strap off one shoulder, and then pushed the other one off as well. That left the skimpy, partly transparent dress crumpled uselessly around her waist. Alan was still very aware of the fact that his Aunt Susie was a married woman. Even though she'd given him permission to gawk, and had told him that her marriage was effectively over, he still felt like a criminal whenever he did. However, despite all the guilt, his lust won out. He couldn't resist turning around again to see what she'd done. He was thrilled to discover that she was completely naked from the waist up. She leaned forward towards the computer screen, exciting him even more. Her breasts were very firm and high. Their nipples poked out as if they were trying to reach all the way to the screen, almost as if they were attempting to pull the rest of the boobs outwards in a frustrated attempt to fly away. She smiled at Alan, then returned to staring at the computer screen as if she were so totally absorbed with the pictures there that she was completely unaware that he was looking only at her and didn't appear to care at all about what was on the screen. She leaned forward on both arms even further, until she was practically over the desk. This caused her dress to slide down her body until it was barely caught by her hips. "Oh, I just love looking at these pictures. I love it." She closed her eyes and wriggled her body slightly back and forth, knowing this would cause her bountiful tits to rock and sway. "I love it. So good," she said again even more enthusiastically. He was beyond shocked, beyond aroused. From the look on her face, he wondered if she was in the throes of an orgasm. He wasn't far off with his guess. She was putting on an exaggerated show, but in actual fact she really was getting close to an orgasm just from acting as an exhibitionist in front of the young man she loved so deeply and wanted so much. Suddenly, she sat back and looked at him very casually. "Don't you?" she asked in a perfectly calm voice. "What was that?" "Don't I what?" asked the stunned teenager. It occurred to him that he'd never actually seen a completely bare bosom in real life before. He was rapidly approaching the limit of how much excitement he could take without spontaneously coming. If he dared to touch his erection in any way whatsoever, he knew it would be all over. "Don't you love the pictures?" Of course, she chided him playfully, knowing full well that he had forgotten all about looking at the computer screen. Then she closed her eyes as she sat, and again her face contorted in such a sexy way that it looked like she was being fucked. She put her hands on her legs and then began rubbing the pale skin there. She quickly reached the edge of her dress, which just barely kept her pussy from being exposed. She reached underneath and began running her hands over the naked skin under her dress. She moved them towards her flat midriff, continually moving higher until her hands were at the waistband of her dress. The effect of having both hands so far under her dress was that her pussy was very nearly exposed to his eyes. But she stopped an inch or so shy of exposing herself there, without touching her pussy. She figured she'd take his seduction one step at a time. He looked down at where he knew her pussy was. He was on the verge of coming, just from imagining what was there, not to mention all the other parts of her that he could see very well. He realized he was building up to an orgasm to end all orgasms, and there was nothing he could do about it. Normally he could just take his hands off his penis to stop or slow down his buildup, but he couldn't do that now because he wasn't touching it in the first place. Suzanne could read in his face his struggle not to come. She said, "It feels so good to have my breasts bounce free like this. Just like I'm sure it feels good that you're hanging out down below. You know." He would have been mortified, except that he was too aroused to feel much other than pure lust. "Of course. Aunt Susie knows all," he. "Why don't you touch yourself and make it feel better? I think you know what I mean. Isn't that what the doctor ordered? Come for me." That command, plus the fact that she was casually squeezing one of her nipples like she was trying to milk it, caused him to lose it. He couldn't take it anymore, so he reached under the desk to jack off openly, no longer caring about the shame of his aunt watching him. But his erection erupted before his hands even reached it. His seed splattered all over the wooden paneling on the back of the desk, just as it had the previous time. The difference was that she was still there, and furthermore what was left of her dress was bunched up around her waist. Alan was tremendously embarrassed that she'd seen and heard him climax while he was obviously thinking of her. But his embarrassment didn't end there, because it seemed like his erection was a fire hose going off, shooting cum everywhere. It simply would not stop. He'd never come so much in his life, and was unused to firing into the open air instead of coming in a towel or tissue. He imagined his balls draining until they were just empty hanging sacks. He grabbed his stiff pole with both hands and held on like he was riding a bucking bronco. She leaned into him and stared over his shoulder, watching the geyser of cum with wide eyes. Finally, mercifully, at long last, it ended. He could only take so much pleasure. He groaned and slowly lowered his head to the table, totally spent. He felt Suzanne's hands patting and rubbing his back through his T-shirt. She said soothingly, "Felt good, didn't it?" Inwardly she marveled at the amount of cum he'd spewed forth. That's one advantage of being in love with a teenager. Boundless enthusiasm. Well, that and he comes by the bucket. Load. He. And his penis is as big as I thought it was to boot. He could only groan again. He was practically unable to speak. There, I'm sure it felt good, sweetie," she continued. "That's what it's all about, isn't it? You have to do that 6 times a day, and then you'll get healthy and strong. I'd like to help out from now on. Do you mind if I help out like this a lot more in the future?" "No, Aunt Susie." He was finally speaking. "God no. That was. Wow. I have to do that 6 times a day." He thought. "I'll die before I'm 20. Help out from now on. A lot more in the future." "You're kidding me. Holy cow." She was getting a kick out of maintaining the fiction that the website had done this to him. Pretty amazing internet porn, huh? I have to agree. That's why those are my favorite pictures. He had hardly paid any attention to the pictures, and he knew she knew it. Maybe he'd looked at them for a moment or two. It was all about her. He thought, Aunt Susie. Live, in the flesh, in my room. Wow. It's like having a live Playboy Playmate of the Year in my room. She got naked in my room. Naked. She still is, right next to me. No clothes. Well, hardly any to speak of. This is Aunt Susie we're talking about. She never so much as winked at me until a few days ago. Suzanne stood up and turned around to look for a towel. Alan had his arms cradling his face on the desk, but he looked up and saw her ass enticingly near to him. All the wetness of Suzanne's sweat and the water she'd used caused her thin dress to stick to the skin of her ass and make it appear transparent. Little did he know, but she had also had a powerful orgasm at the same time he did, also without even touching herself. Her own juices were dripping down her legs, which was why she wanted a towel. Alan, though, had been so busy checking out the way the moist fabric clung to her ass cheeks that he didn't notice her leakage. There were some silky hand towels and tissues next to his bed, which he used when masturbating. She said, "Here we are," and went to grab them. He immediately jumped up from his chair and shouted, "No." He quickly crossed the room. What I mean is," he said more calmly as he reached her, "please let me do it myself. This is really embarrassing." She had grabbed one of the towels, but he quickly snatched it from her hands. He knew that the one she had picked up, bunched up on top of the others, was the one into which he'd deposited his load when he'd masturbated earlier in the afternoon. He was petrified that she'd find his cum, dried or maybe still wet, on the towel. It was a bit irrational since he'd just come like the old faithful geyser, but he wasn't anywhere close to thinking straight. He was so focused on the towel problem that he didn't realize he was now standing opposite her with his penis still hanging out of his shorts. Normally it would have been hard again, given the look at her ass that he'd just had, but it was still only at half-mast because he'd come 3 times in the last hour and a half. She did notice though, and was secretly delighted. Better to not let on that I noticed how he's hangin', or he'll cover up, she thought happily. What a hunk. So fit, and well hung to boot. He's so ripe, just like a succulent fruit ready to be picked. A virgin too, all for little ol' me, he. He immediately bent down under his desk and wiped the cum off the wood and carpet using his already soiled towel. Now it was her turn to gaze at a nice ass, since his was wiggling in the air in his barely sufficient short shorts. Simultaneously she grabbed another towel and used it to wipe the sex juices from her legs, now that he wasn't looking. She thought, "Man, I came a river, didn't I? This is excellent. It's been years since something like that. I must have been dripping all over the floor as I walked around." She realized delightedly, this room is going to smell like a cum splattered whorehouse for days. She was getting horny all over again as she moved in for a closer view of his ass. What a beautiful young man. He has it all, in front and in back. And he's just so kind and good-hearted. God, I want to rip those shorts right off him. But she also realized she had to pace herself. That's enough for today. I probably went too far as it is. He's so shy and na.ve. If I don't watch out I'll literally kill him with excitement. Tomorrow I'll take things just a bit further. It's not just a matter of what he wants. I'm sure I could get him to fuck me if I took the lead, and he'd love it. But I have to think about what Susan and Angel would think, and work them along at the same time. It's impossible to keep a secret for long in this house. Okay, sweetie, I'll leave that to you, she said. He was still under the desk, furiously trying to clean. Same time tomorrow. When she didn't get an answer, she added, "Just say yes." Yes, she heard him mutter from under the desk. Then, with much more enthusiasm, yes. Definitely yes. He popped his head back out, looked her way and gave her a big grin. She grinned back. Okay. Don't tell Susan about any of this, okay, sweetie. She opened the door and looked around the hallway. Looks like no one was eavesdropping. Oops. She looked down and realized her boobs were still hanging out of her dress. She quickly popped them back in, then decided to head for the bathroom to change and make herself more publicly presentable. She was still wet and sweaty. She had one parting comment. One last thing. You should really get a fan in here and ventilate your room. It reeks of your cum. Personally I love it, but it might upset your mother. Ta. The idea of Suzanne loving the smell of his cum, coupled with the thought of her returning, had gotten him as mentally aroused as he could be. Unfortunately, his penis refused to react. He managed to get it up again half an hour later, at which point he came quickly by reliving what Suzanne had done in his room. This certainly is going to be a near-record day. Chapter 23 Susan and Suzanne's Outfit. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. That night, Suzanne stayed for dinner, as she sometimes did. Sometimes she'd even cook and eat dinner with her family, then rush next door and sit with the Plumbers during their meal. She wore yet another revealing outfit and wanted Susan to do the same. Suzanne thought, things are coming along nicely with Sweetie. Or should I say coming, he. Angel came up with her own sexing things up plan, so I don't see much need for intervention there. The biggest obstacle by far is Susan. Getting her to loosen up is my toughest challenge. So this time when Suzanne pressed Susan to wear a certain dress and Susan said no, Suzanne simply didn't accept that answer. Over the years she had realized that she had a dominant personality while Susan's was submissive. She'd never taken significant advantage of that, since Susan was such a close friend, but now she did. She ended up commanding her, "You will wear that dress. Now. Period. Don't give me any excuses. It's for the health of your son. What kind of mother are you, if you won't help him in his time of need?" Susan held the dress up. "But I can't. Look at it. It's scandalous. He's going to have all kinds of sinful thoughts about me, and I'm his mother." "Susan. You don't get it. That's the whole damn point. They're just thoughts. There's no such thing as a thought crime in this country. He needs every bit of visual stimulation he can get. Have mercy on his plight. Put the dress on already." So Susan wore the dress. It was an extremely low-cut, black, dinner dress. It showed so much cleavage that one could almost see her belly button. Susan had a hard time walking downstairs and into the dining room area where Catherine and Alan were sitting. Suzanne literally had to push her from behind, across the living room and into the dining room. Susan stood there, blushing furiously. She sat down, took one look at Alan sitting across from her, and then stood up again. "Oh Tiger, I'm sorry. Suzanne is being so mean. She said I have to wear this, but it's really too much, isn't it? First the dorky maid outfit and now this. I'd better go and change." She turned around, but Suzanne was behind her with her hands on her shoulders again and wouldn't let her escape. Both Alan and Catherine were stunned, though they tried not to show it. Catherine was wearing a typical outfit but she thought, shit. If even Mom is dressing like that, what am I doing in this? Cool. This is a green light to go all out next time. Alan was desperate to put his mother at ease so she wouldn't stop dressing like that. No. Wait, Mom. I really appreciate what you're trying to do, helping me with visual stimulation and all. When I see you like that, it makes me proud to have a mom who cares enough to help me out. I feel so loved, so cared for. Please stay." His words struck the bull's eye. Suzanne was very pleased and thought, he couldn't have done any better if I'd coached him. But that's just my Sweetie being the sweet, lovable boy that he really is. Susan was weakening. She asked, "Are you sure, son?" "I don't know." She turned back around and held her arms underneath her boobs, inadvertently causing them to press forward and threaten to spill out of her dress. "Dressed like this, I feel so. Oh, I can't say it." He asked, "Feel so what?" "It's just a cocktail dress, Mom." "I know, but I feel so naked." She barely whispered the word naked, then blushed and closed her eyes. His dick, already at full attention, tried to escape from his shorts. He had to struggle not to moan out loud, because her innocent sexuality was so extremely arousing. Catherine spoke up. "Mom, it's no big deal. That kind of dress is way common. Relax. Come on and eat dinner already." So Susan sat down, but she could hardly look anyone else in the eye during the meal. Such clothing was completely unheard of for her. With all three women there during dinner, Alan was so transfixed looking from one woman to another that he had a hard time remembering to occasionally put food in his mouth. His erection tented his pants out so obscenely that he was fairly surprised the fabric didn't just rip apart. Suzanne sat next to him at the table, positioning herself so that she had a private view of his crotch. She delighted in looking furtively at the bulge in his pants, seeing whether she could provoke its extension even further. Since she was sitting next to him, she sat very close and brushed up against his shoulder and arm whenever she could. At one point she squeezed his knee under the table, as if providing a gesture of support for what he was saying. She saw from his face that her touch had almost caused him to come in his shorts, so she refrained from moving her hands even more aggressively. Midway through the meal she thought, he's so overwhelmed with lust that if I provoke him any more, it'll be just plain mean. So she backed off for a while. After dinner ended and things settled down a bit, Suzanne again took the lead in pushing further. The four of them retired to the living room to hang out and watch TV. Suzanne wore a low-cut dress without a bra, which was about the third change of clothes she'd made that day for Alan's sake. Suzanne had adopted a new habit of leaning forward as if deeply engrossed in the conversation. That action didn't just show her nipples if one looked at the right angle, it exposed all of her tits no matter what angle one chose to look from. Suzanne's tit flashes were so obvious that even Susan noticed them. Suzanne, don't you think you should be careful about your dress?" "What?" "Oh, right." Suzanne pulled herself back and her nipples were once again covered up, though just barely. "That's the problem in wearing this sexy stuff. Sometimes you show more than you realize." Within minutes, Suzanne was bending forward again and showing off her incredible, creamy breasts. She was more careful not to do it when Susan would notice, though. At the same time, Susan was still in her black cocktail dress, and that was as arousing to Alan as seeing Suzanne's boobs hanging out. It was all he could do not to come right in his shorts. Eventually he could take no more and hurried off to his room to masturbate. When he got back to the living room, he got so excited all over again that within minutes he had to make another trip to his room. He felt like someone with the runs, forced to rush to the bathroom to relieve himself every few minutes, except he was masturbating each time instead. Suzanne had planned to go back to Alan's room again, but she realized that another visit might be overkill. He'd made 2 quick exits to his room and Suzanne at least had no doubt what he'd been doing there. If he gets any more sexually stimulated, he's liable to blow a gasket, she thought with great glee. He must be falling in lust with me. Since he already loves me dearly, we're going to be so happy. So close. My dream is so close to being realized. I don't care if I'm married and he's half my age. True love conquers all. Susan found herself strangely jealous of all the attention that Suzanne was getting from Alan. As the evening wore on and she wore her revealing dress for hours, she grew more and more comfortable in it. By the end of the evening, she thought to herself, if Suzanne's showing herself off that much, then maybe this dress isn't such a big deal after all. Besides, you can find this kind of dress at just about any formal party. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if I show myself off just a little bit more. Catherine was also taking note of Susan's increasing comfort with wearing the dress. That just emboldened her further about also wearing such outfits. Susan and Catherine were reaching the conclusion that they wanted to do more to help with Alan's 6x-day problem. Meanwhile, Suzanne was one smugly satisfied cougar, happy that her plan was coming along so nicely. Chapter 24 Susan's and Suzanne's Wild Desire. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After school late the next afternoon, Alan found himself sitting in the living room with Suzanne while Susan was cooking dinner in the kitchen. Suzanne had been reading the newspaper, but Alan took advantage of the chance to be alone with her to ask a question. "Aunt Susie." She put the newspaper down and smiled his way. He dropped his voice. You know what you said the other night, that I could stare at your boobs. Is that true for any time, or just when we're checking out the websites together?" He was staring at them even as he spoke, and he had definitely noticed that she wasn't wearing a bra. He wanted to see more. Suzanne looked at him with slight indignation. Just in your room, of course. What kind of woman do you think I am? But even as she said that, the shoulder straps on her dress began to slide down her shoulders. She continued to protest, it's not like I'm going to take my clothes off for you any old time. I am a married woman, you know. I have my limits. As she spoke, both shoulder straps slid off simultaneously and the top of her dress fell down, leaving her exposed from the waist up. She pretended to be oblivious and indignant, but she couldn't stop from grinning just a little. He grinned a lot. I see. I'm sure you do. She was grinning even more, almost laughing. She was especially pleased to see the big bulge that erupted in his shorts. He asked with genuine curiosity, how did you do that? It's like the straps moved on their own. Were you wiggling your shoulders slightly or something? I have no idea what you're talking about. Boy, is it just me, or did it get hot in here all of a sudden? She fanned herself, which set her big boobs swaying. He smiled some more, but then rushed upstairs to masturbate yet again. He paused on the stairs to exclaim, thanks for the help, Aunt Susie. She pulled her dress back up and went back to reading the newspaper. Yep. Things are getting a lot more interesting around here. I can't wait until the time is ripe for him to do more than just look. Susan came in from the kitchen a few moments later. She asked Suzanne, where'd Tiger go? Did I hear his feet clomping up the stairs? You did. He went upstairs to do his thing. Oh. She felt a tingle of excitement as she imagined him masturbating just a few feet away, but she pushed the lewd thought away. Suzanne patted a spot on the sofa next to where she sat. Come here for a moment, please. Susan walked over and sat down. Suzanne said, I think it's time you told me about your dreams last night. Susan dropped her head and sighed sadly. I was afraid you were going to say that. Indeed, Suzanne's suggestion was no surprise because Susan had stayed mum about her latest dreams, and Suzanne had been pestering her about them all day long. Suzanne knew the dreams must have been really outrageous, because Susan normally trusted her with even her most intimate thoughts and feelings. Suzanne patted her head. I know it's tough. If it helps you, I'll tell you one of my dreams from last night. I dreamt you and I were sitting right here, in this very room. And Sweetie was with us too. Except, he was the only one sitting on the sofa. You and I, we were both buck naked, kneeling between his legs. Susan gasped. No. Yes, it's true. Actually, it was only partially true. Suzanne's real dreams mostly revolved around Alan fucking her, but she knew Susan wasn't ready to hear that. And those were just her milder dreams. She often dreamt of orgies involving her, Alan, Catherine, and Susan. She actually had dreamt of what she was in the middle of describing, but it was only a small snippet of a much wilder dream scene. She continued, Sweetie wasn't wearing any clothes either, and... No. Susan gasped again. Suzanne couldn't help but grin a little at the intensity of Susan's reaction. Look, I can't get very far if you keep gasping no every few seconds. Sorry. But it's just so scandalous. Was his big, member? Was it all? Susan blushed. Was it hard? And thick? And just there in the open, for anyone to see? It was. Very hard and very thick. And totally exposed. No. Susan gasped even louder. Suzanne had to stifle a giggle. And it was hot too. We both found out just how hot it was because we held it in our hands. What, both of us? Holding it at the same time? Sure. Why not? It certainly is long enough and thick enough for two hands to hold it and caress it. But that's not possible. Au contraire. It may not be possible with many normal dot-sized penises, but our sweetie has an extraordinary penis. In fact, not only was there room for your hand and my hand to be stroking his thick, tree-trunk-like shaft and head, but we both had our other hand on his balls and we were fondling down there as well. No. But this time, Susan spoke in a quiet, awed whisper instead of a disbelieving shout. It's true, Suzanne replied. Because a wonderful penis like his requires a lot of special, tender loving care. And not just his penis, but his balls too. Guys love having their balls fondled if you do it in the right way. Never forget that. The next time you're jacking him off and you find yourself with a hand free, try playing gently with his balls. I can teach you the right method. The next time. There won't be any such thing. Suzanne, there wasn't even a first time. Suzanne cleverly replied, of course there is. In dreams. And in this dream, you and I worked together to treat this kingly cock the way it needed to be treated. Stroking and sliding, and sliding and stroking, and stroking and stroking and stroking all those hot inches of thick, manly meat. Our fingers making obscene slurpy sounds as we slip and slide up and down his soaked, stiff snake. Susan felt as if the temperature in the room had just risen 20 degrees. She found her ample chest heaving as she struggled for air. But why? Why is it so wet? His, member, I mean. Suzanne acted incredulous that Susan didn't know these things. It's soaked because he's leaking so much pre-cum. And a mighty erection like his takes a lot of stroking before it shoots its prize reward of creamy cum, even with 4 talented female hands working on it and his balls, so everything gets wetter and wetter all the time. Naturally, our hands will be wet and sticky too, from sloshing our way through all the cummy goodness. Susan had a vivid imagination, so she could clearly picture and hear, and even smell, what Suzanne was describing. She felt faint. She put her hands over her ears like a petulant little child, even as her chest was heaving from how that made her feel. I've heard enough. That sounds gross. In fact, this whole dream is far too obscene. I can't take any more. Why, just listening to this filthy talk is probably a sin. Suzanne shook her head a little bit in secret amusement. Knowing that Susan could still hear her, she said, suit yourself. But then you'll never find out about all the sexy things he said to us in the dream, or about the blowjobs. Susan looked into Suzanne's eyes with increased alarm, but also with a great deal of curiosity. Blowjobs. You told me about that before, when you talked about your affairs. Isn't that when a woman puts a man's, member, in her mouth and, she kind of. Seeing that Susan was having trouble, Suzanne said, she sucks on it like a lollipop. Yes. Susan shivered all over. She hoped it looked like a shiver of disgust, and it was, but it was also a shiver of arousal. She dropped her hands finally. Yuck. How can a woman do that? It's so disgusting. On the contrary. It's divine. The pleasure for the man is immense, and contrary to popular belief, a woman can get a lot of pleasure from it too. You really should try it sometime. With my tiger. Suzanne, what are you suggesting? Hey, I didn't say him specifically. I was speaking in general. But anyway, before you get in a big huff about that, I was trying to be helpful and share my dreams with you so you wouldn't think yours are so strange. Since all of this has started, you haven't even asked me once about my dreams. As you can see, they're a lot like yours. Susan crossed her arms under her huge rack in a huff. Well, hardly a lot alike. I've dreamed a lot of weird things lately, but at least I don't dream of putting his thing in my mouth. That's just. It's so improper, I can't even begin to say. Whatever, Suzanne replied a bit testily. In any case, my point is, what I was saying about having sexual dreams to burn off sexual urges, that goes for me as well as you. I've been having a lot of dreams. In fact, some are even more sexual than that. I'd rather not go into it all for fear that it would shock your delicate sensibilities. Thank you, although I'm afraid you're a bit too late on that one. After a pause, she asked shyly, about this blowjob activity. What exactly happened there? Suzanne replied casually, as if she were detailing a shopping trip, well, I held his big erection by the base and licked and lapped all around its head. That's the most sensitive part, you know. Then I put my mouth around the whole head. Susan cut in, what, you took that entire thing in your mouth? Just like that? Suzanne rolled her eyes. Have I not told you about this many times before, when I detailed some of my affairs? Well yeah, but that was different. That was just, I dunno, some unreal fantasies. This is real. You're talking about a very real Alan and his very real member. You can't just put that in your mouth. Why not? It's too big, for one. Susan didn't realize it, but her nipples had become quite visibly erect. It is not, Suzanne said defensively. I've had bigger. And in the dream, you and I were taking turns and handling its size quite well. Taking turns. Suzanne, what are you saying here? Do you mean to say that I was sucking on it too? But of course. We both have to do all we can to help him do his thing 6 times a day, right? It's just that, in the dream, we were even more willing to help than in real life. Susan spaced out. Oh my goodness. Licking his member. It's true I've thought of that a little here and there, in my most wicked and wanton thoughts. I may never have given a blowjob myself, if that's the right lingo these days, but I've heard it talked about in some rather improper movies and TV shows. But still, to do it. That would be too weird to even contemplate. And then to do it with Suzanne licking it at the same time. Oh my. That's just too naughty. Just thinking about it is probably some kind of sin. I mean, how would that work, anyway? True, Tiger has an exceedingly large member, but wouldn't our heads bump together all the time just the same? And what about Suzanne's long tongue? She tries to hide it, but over the years I've noticed that she has easily the longest tongue I've ever seen. I hate to say this, but it's almost something you'd see in a circus. How in heaven could we both lick him at the same time if I have to share him with that? Wouldn't our tongues touch from time to time, if only by accident? I don't want my tongue to touch that long slug of hers. Ew. But then again, Tiger would love it, wouldn't he? I can just imagine how hot and horny he'd get, enjoying both his mother and his aunt lapping and licking all over his big dick. Big member. I can practically hear him moaning with delight. He'd be the luckiest kid in his entire high school, that's for sure. Everyone says Suzanne is like some kind of goddess, and the truth is, I look an awful lot like her. People say I look pretty darn good too, as a matter of fact. Boy, wouldn't that be a special treat for my cutie Tiger, for him to wake up one morning and find his busty mommy and busty auntie both lovingly lapping all over his so thick and so long member. We could take turns stroking it too. Oh, I wish I could see his face if we did all that. So hot. Of course, that's just a wild flight of my imagination. We couldn't. Ever. It would be so wrong. Yet. Somehow. So right. Doesn't a special boy like him deserve a special tongue bath by his 2 most favorite ladies? Suzanne could teach me just what to do, and before long he'd get so excited that he'd just have to squirt his cum all over the place. But it's a sin. Why am I thinking these thoughts? Suzanne waited patiently, watching unobtrusively while Susan seemed to bliss out and go to some distant place for about a minute. She correctly figured Susan was having an erotic fantasy, which Suzanne was keen to encourage. But then, Susan snapped back with surprising speed, as if there hadn't been any pause at all. Suzanne. These ideas of yours, they're just unacceptable. Even for a dream, you just can't go there. I'm his mother. And the thought of sucking on it, well. It's just too. She suddenly stood up. It's too. It's too. Something. This is just not the kind of conversation a good Christian woman should be having. Once again she crossed her arms defiantly under her ample bust. Suzanne grinned. Okay, fine. Never mind about that then. She knew ideas had been planted that hopefully would flourish and grow over time. She patted the seat next to her on the sofa again. Sit back down and tell me all about your dream. Susan got a panicky look. No. That is to say, no thank you. Suzanne stood up. Susan, I just told you a very personal, very embarrassing dream. We're best friends. Can't you do the same for me? Susan pretended to be distracted. What was that? Did you just hear a buzzing sound? I think that was the washer going off. I'd better go check. Suzanne sighed quietly as she watched Susan scurry off. She knew there hadn't been any buzzing sound, but she didn't want to push her friend too hard. She picked up the newspaper she'd been reading before Alan had come into the room. As she resumed her reading, she thought, that went pretty well, all things considered. I'm still dying to find out what her dream was, but talking about my dreams is an excellent idea. I need to do more of that. I can introduce or re-familiarize her with all kinds of sexual ideas. She's so na.ve about these things that it blows my mind sometimes. Chapter 25 Internet P****N viewing session. You're listening at novelfull.audio. Suzanne had to go home to cook dinner for her own family, but she returned to the Plummer house after dinner and went straight to Alan's room. She and Alan had another internet porn viewing session, which really meant another staring at Suzanne nearly naked session. At first, events unfolded almost identically to the night before, but Alan wasn't complaining. He could only dream that things would go on like that every night. Suzanne had even told him to keep his penis hanging out of his shorts beneath the desk, just as he had the 2 times before. But then it got even better. Suzanne still insisted on the pretense that they were looking at internet porn, though Alan ended up facing her, with only token glances at the screen. While she pretended to be busy viewing the porn, not only had her top fallen off again, but her pleated skirt slowly rode up her thighs until the hem of it reached her pussy. Then, ever so slowly, she slumped forward in her chair. But by some clever manipulation, she went forward while her dress did not, causing the hem to ride up over her pussy, exposing some of her bush. Alan was absolutely beside himself. It was the first time he'd seen her pussy from so close. He was so excited that he forgot to breathe for quite a long time. The fact that her skirt was a lot like a cheerleader's skirt only increased his excitement. Suzanne had made sure it was the same shade of red as his school's cheerleading uniforms, like the one that Amy wore. But then, only a minute or two later, Suzanne acted as if she were uncomfortable and shifted positions, which completely covered her pussy again. She quelled his disappointment by saying, "Sweetie, the whole purpose of me being here is to help you have lots of nice climaxes, so why don't you start now?" "You mean?" She grinned, picked up a towel, and handed it to him. "Let's not give that board under your desk any more messy grief." He took the towel and put it down near him, but then said, "I dunno. I'd like to, but I'm having such a good time. And I'm so excited that I know if I touch it, it'll all be over in seconds. I really want to keep having fun." She suggested, "Then touch it and shoot off. I'm in no big rush to go anywhere, so get hard again. When you recover, you'll last a lot longer and we'll have even more fun." He couldn't turn down that offer. So, as predicted, he came into the towel more or less instantly. He was terribly embarrassed about coming with Suzanne right there. She didn't even turn away to give him a moment of privacy. He consoled himself that at least the towel allowed him to keep his erection hidden as he squirted. His penis started to go flaccid, but that only lasted a few seconds because he happened to look up and saw her staring at his towel-covered boner with a ravenous hunger. She even licked her lips. Just like that, his dick was once again as stiff as a board. He bashfully removed the towel so he could resume stroking himself. Suzanne shook her head and muttered something about the resilience of youth. He thought, Jesus H. Christ on a pogo stick. I'm sitting here with my hot, hard dick in my hands, and Aunt Susie is sitting within arm's reach, wearing nothing but a short skirt. Holy hell. And I did my best to clean up with the towel, but everything's still sticky and cummy. I would be way too embarrassed to go on, but she's just so fucking hot that I can't help but stroke myself some more. Dang. If only I could touch her, and then kiss her. He resumed stroking, but he was self-conscious about it, so he mostly hid what he was doing under the desk. She reached out and patted his knee. Are you okay, sweetie? Yeah. Did that feel good? Hell yeah. You have no friggin' idea. She chuckled. Actually, I do. Women have big orgasms too, you know, and we can have them repeatedly without fading. I know that. It's just that. It's not just the physical pleasure. I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you, and I'm openly jacking off at the same time. And you're this topless bombshell knockout, and yet you're still my lovable Aunt Susie. It's all too much. It feels so great that my brain is gonna explode. She snickered, warn me before that happens, okay? I don't want pieces of you splattered all over me. Her scratchy voice dropped into an extra sexy purr. Unless it's your pearly cum. He whimpered with insane arousal. While he kept on stroking, Suzanne periodically looked at the internet porn and gave running commentaries about what she wanted to do with the attractive women pictured there. She said things like, "Ooh, sweetie, look at this one. She's a hottie. Look at that rack, wouldn't you just love to play with those zeppelins? You think they're real? Mine are all real, you know." She raised her twin globes and let them bounce freely. And look at those lips. So full, so kissable. Lips like those belong wrapped around a cock, don't you think? Who would you rather have suck your cock, me or Ms. Zeppelin here? Alan squeaked out as he masturbated. You. She laughed. Good answer. But I'd hate for Ms. Zeppelin to miss out on that tree trunk you're trying to hide beneath the desk. Maybe she and I can take turns blowing you. She leaned forward and whispered into his ear, you know, from this angle I can see everything. I think I'll just stay here with my head perched on your shoulder and watch you spank your salami. I can't wait to see that volcano of teenage lust explode. She cooed into his ear, next time, don't use a towel and cover up all the good stuff, okay? I want to see you come into your hand. She switched back to her regular voice while keeping her head in a position where she could easily see what he was doing to his boner. She resumed her picture narration. Ms. Zeppelin has a mighty fine pussy too. Look at those nether lips, all puffed up and meaty. I wouldn't mind a taste of that. Can you just imagine her and me locked in a 60.9? She went on and on in this manner, describing in intimate detail all of the things that she and he could do to the pictured porn models. All the while, she leaned forward toward him, keeping her big tits swaying and jiggling. The more excited she got, the more she leaned his way, until it practically felt like her boobs were resting against his face. He would have been unable to resist reaching out to touch them, except that both his hands were busy under the desk masturbating. Needless to say, Alan's second climax with her present wasn't too long in arriving. He panted, Aunt Susie. Gonna come. She somehow leaned over even more. Her head was actually directly over his crotch as she breathed excitedly, do it. Do it. Come into your hands. One of his hands kept stroking his length while the other one cupped the tip and caught the full force of his cum rocketing out. Had he not done that, he would have thoroughly splattered Suzanne's face. Suzanne was so delighted that she actually clapped when he finished. Excellent. Sweetie, that was really hot. Oh, this is such fun. Don't you think? We're gonna have so much fun together. He was left completely exhausted, slumping in his chair. He felt that even talking was an effort, but nevertheless he asked, "We're gonna do this again?" "Oh, certainly. Now that we're this intimate, I want to see you come over and over again. That is, unless you're too shy about it." "No, no, I'm cool. It's just that." "Geez. What? For one thing, what am I supposed to do with my hands?" He held them up. There was so much cum that there were gobs stretched between his fingers like spider webs. Suzanne ostentatiously licked her lips. Yummy. Is that all for me? Do you want me to lick you clean, or would you rather use the towel?" His eyes bugged out and he felt like he was going to have a heart attack. Smirking a bit she said, "You're right. We'd better use the towel. This time." She picked up the towel and handed it to him. But her teasing never stopped. As he wiped his hands clean, she made a point of inhaling his aroma deeply. She said, yes. Sweetie, your cum smells so sweet. I really love the smell. I can hardly wait to taste it." He shook his head in disbelief. Alan loved the whole encounter, but it was the brief sight of his Aunt Susie's pussy that he vowed to never forget. He wrongly assumed that all her sexy talk was just that. Talk. He didn't even really believe Suzanne was bisexual, since he'd never observed the slightest hint of that in all the many years that he'd known her. In addition, he was so inexperienced sexually that the idea of actually having full-blown intercourse with her seemed beyond impossible. He felt that she was the living embodiment of Jessica Rabbit, and he was just a nerd who'd never been kissed whom she was helping with his weird medical treatment. So, for him, her pussy was merely some far-off wonder that one could only admire and never touch. Chapter 26 Catherine's Flash. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. After Suzanne left, Alan went to the living room to watch TV by himself. Catherine knew when the late show he was watching would end, and knew she could tell exactly when he'd return to his room by the sound of the TV turning off. So she went into the bathroom, took a shower, and waited. As Alan came down the hallway heading towards his room, Catherine took advantage of the fact that the bathroom was across the hallway from his room and, when she heard his footsteps nearby, burst out into the hallway wearing only a towel. Her timing was perfect. She bumped right into him. The bump was nothing special, but the towel was barely hanging on to her, so, as she pulled away from him, the towel fell down in a seemingly accidental way. He watched in what seemed to be slow motion as the towel fell away and her breasts slowly came into view. However, she wasn't fully comfortable with this kind of behavior, even though she'd initiated it. She grabbed the towel in mid-air and clutched it to her body, preventing it from falling any further. Her face had already looked nervous and guilty before the towel fell, but appeared even more so afterwards. Her blush was hardly feigned. He wasn't looking at her face, but rather at her breasts that were still exposed above the arms now wrapping the towel around her. She looked down, saw what she was still exposing, and blushed even deeper. She cried, "Alan," and looked at him in dismay, as if the whole thing was his fault. Then she fled to her room. No other words were said between them during the whole incident, and they barely made eye contact. He was far too aroused to question why his sister had come out of the bathroom in just a towel, something he'd never seen her do before. Despite all the recent nudity around the house, he couldn't imagine that she would ever expose herself on purpose, especially since she seemed perturbed about it. He just assumed that he'd had an incredibly lucky free show. He hurried back to his room to masturbate for the 6th time that day, which count included 2 times in bed early that morning. He'd never realized that it was physically possible for a male to masturbate as many times a day as he was now doing. He was too wiped out for any more that night, but his brain could think of little else but all the excitement he'd had that day. Not only did Catherine flash him with the towel, but she and Suzanne had been dressing sexily and acting provocatively all day. And then there was Aunt Susie's visit. His mother hadn't worn anything particularly revealing, but he still could easily recall her black cocktail dress from the night before. Just down the hallway, Catherine was in her room, lying in her bed, also pleasuring herself. Her chest pounded with excitement from the brief exposure, and it was a long time before her breath returned to normal. She thought, that was so scary. So scary. But so good. I can't help myself. I just have to do it again. Soon. After she roused herself, she got up and sat down at her desk in the nude. She got out her diary, unlocked it and wrote. Dear Diary, it happened again. I was so bad. I ambushed brother and dropped my towel so he could see my boobs. Damn it, I know I'm not a living goddess like Mom and Aunt Susie, but people say I'm still pretty darn attractive. It's not like I'm some kind of fugly beast. And my boobs aren't super, mom-sized, but they're still pretty big compared to the other girls in school. The important thing was that brother seems to like them. He was totally gawking. I could see him staring like a ravenous wolf. For a second there I thought he might reach up and cup them from underneath. I even saw his arms start to move. But alas, it was not to be. Then I got all chicken and rushed back into my room. Diary, I'm such a loser. It was the perfect opportunity and I chickened out. I was so horny that I couldn't think straight and I still lost my nerve. I listened in on brother and Aunt Susie again, and that was so fucking hot that I'm surprised they didn't burn the house down. From what I could hear through the door, brother came twice while she just sat there and watched the whole thing from close up. The first time he came into a towel, but the second time he came into his hands. His bare hands. Geez, I'm getting all hot and wet just thinking about it all over again. Diary, can you picture that, his big strong hands sliding up and down his long fat cock? What I wouldn't give to be in Aunt Susie's shoes. She's such a lucky bitch. I swear, life is so unfair. I would totally love to help bro out with doing his thing, but Mom would never allow it in a million years. Truth is, she's a big ol' lovable softie, but when she gets mad, she gets really mad. And I know for sure that she'd get mad if she ever caught me stroking bro's thick cock. But who knows what'll happen. Aunt Susie is definitely breaking down barriers. Mom's starting to dress in sexy clothes and talks openly about bro doing his thing. It's like a door has been opened, and I need to squeeze into the gap and help push it open even wider. I dream every night that I'll be called on to help him do his thing. In other words, run my hands all over his mighty cock until he squirts all over my face. Or, even better, suck on his meat until he comes right down my throat. Aunt Susie even said that his cum smells really yummy, and I believe her. Everything about my brother is just a living dream. God, I love him so much. And the stupid fathead doofus doesn't even have a clue. He can be so frustrating sometimes. Grr. Anyway, diary, I can hardly wait until tomorrow. I'm gonna be right there with my ear to the door the next time Aunt Susie goes into his room. I only wish I could be in the room and see what was happening. I swear, I'm seriously tempted to hide in his closet or something. But knowing me, I'd make too much noise and get caught and ruin everything. Chapter 27 Susan's Shower Tease. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Friday afternoon, Alan played a game of basketball with some friends. He came home really needing a shower, but the one across from his room was broken. No one but Suzanne knew that she had disabled it, in the hope that Alan would be forced to use the shower off Susan's bedroom, which might result in interesting encounters. He went into his mother's bedroom and heard the shower running in the adjoining bathroom. He was really sweaty and tired, so he yelled through the bathroom door, "Hello. I could use a shower real soon." It was his mother who replied, "Sorry. You'll have to wait. I just got in here." Grumbling, he went back to his room and started reading. He removed his shirt because the sweat continued to pour off him. He left his door open to listen for when the shower was free. Susan's shampoo bottle was empty. She was sure that she'd had plenty of shampoo the last time she'd showered. She didn't know that Suzanne had drained her bottle and made sure Catherine wasn't around to help get another one. She remembered Suzanne's advice, not so coincidentally given just an hour earlier, to take advantage of situations that arose to help sex things up, such as giving Alan a brief glimpse of her in the shower. So she said, "Hey Tiger. Can you come here for a sec?" He got up and went to the bathroom door so he could hear her better. "Yeah. What is it?" "I'm out of shampoo. Can you come in here and get another bottle for me?" "Sure." He screwed up his courage and walked into the bathroom. The shower door was closed, so he could see little of his mother except her vague, fleshy shape through the frosted glass. Yet knowing that his voluptuous mother was completely naked on the other side got his penis hard within seconds. The shower door opened just enough for her hand to poke out, holding a shampoo bottle. She said, "The bottle here is empty, but you should find another just like it in the bottom right cabinet. It's the only shampoo in there." He quickly found the right bottle and held it in his hand. He didn't know what to do with it. How do you want me to give it to you?" he asked, and then realized that wasn't the best way to phrase things, given the circumstances. Susan had been expecting to just give him a tantalizing, obscured glimpse of her body through the frosted shower door. Frankly, that was all Suzanne expected as well, assuming that her attempt to disrupt the shower even worked. But Susan found herself saying, "Just put it in my hand." As soon as the words left her mouth, she thought, why on earth did I just say that? Now he's going to have to open the shower door and see me completely naked. She didn't even realize it consciously, but she'd loved having her son stare at her the past few days when she'd worn sexy outfits. Unconsciously she wanted more, even if her rational brain did not. He was at a loss over what to do. She'd pulled her hand back, and it didn't look like she was going to reach back out to him. Since the door was only open a crack, he didn't see how he could get the shampoo to her without opening the door. But more than that, he could barely think or breathe, since he had such a great view of her nudity through the slightly opened door. He couldn't believe that his mother, the same mother who had told him that dancing was sinful and bikinis should be illegal, would let him see her in the buff. After some long moments passed, she still didn't make any move to reach toward him. So, reluctantly and nervously, he reached to open the shower door. He was immediately immobilized by the lusty and lovely vision before him. Susan stood with her back to him, lathering her body with soap. She seemed to be unaware of his presence. But in fact, her heart was pounding wildly and her face was burning at the realization that he was looking at her completely naked body. She had no idea what she was doing or why, but her intellect seemed helpless to overrule her libido. A few moments passed where he just stared at her back. He thought, my God. I have never seen any woman so scorching hot anywhere in my life. Not even on TV or in movies. Not even Aunt Susie. Every inch is complete perfection. Father must be absolutely insane to be away practically all year. Man, if I had a wife like that, I would never, ever, ever leave the bedroom. Seriously. He'd been erect already, but now his erection was so engorged that it seemed like it had swollen to twice its normal size when firm. He just stood and stared. Finally, she turned her body partly towards him while reaching out to grab the bottle, but then realized that the glass shower door was still mostly closed. She said over her shoulder, "Could you open the door, Tiger?" He reached out to do so, but his hands seemed to move as slowly as molasses. He wanted to prolong this once-in-a-lifetime experience as long as he could. His eyes devoured her firm ass, shapely back, and the side view of one tremendous boob while her eyes watched the progress of his hands opening the door. Finally the door opened. Her vision wasn't that bad without glasses, so she could see him fine except that he looked somewhat blurry. She was surprised to see him without a top, and for a second she feared that he had stripped naked. She looked down and realized with great relief that he was still wearing his shorts, but in so doing she couldn't help but notice the pulsing monster threatening to rip them in two. They both realized there was nothing between their private parts but air and Alan's shorts. That both excited and frightened her. Susan started to freak out as she thought about it. She reached out, grabbed the bottle, and turned her back on him. Thanks a ton. She was too embarrassed to make further eye contact. She thought her little dare of sorts was over, so breathed a big sigh of relief. Phew. Thank goodness. What's gotten into me? He probably saw all of my bouncing boobs when I reached out. Heck, what am I talking about? He's certainly staring at my butt this very instant. That's so improper. Alan stood there transfixed. He mumbled, Sure. He tried to drink in as much of her naked body as he could, hoping to burn the image permanently into his brain. It was the first time in his teen life that he'd ever seen a woman fully naked, since Suzanne hadn't completely taken her skirt off the day before. I'll just be going then, he said after a few more seconds. His eyes focused mostly on her sudsy buttocks, but they roamed everywhere. Even her toned, muscular legs and the gentle curves of her back somehow seemed to be demanding his urgent attention. Susan closed her eyes tightly. She was sure he was still there, still staring. Her thoughts drifted to the big bulge she'd seen in his shorts, and then drifted back to the memory of Akami stroking it in the doctor's office. She couldn't consciously admit to herself just how proud it made her that her body had gotten him so hard, but the feeling was good enough that she couldn't muster the resolve to ensure that he left. In fact, she stepped back and turned a bit, giving him a better side view of her glistening wet body. She brought her hands to her breasts, though it was unclear, even to herself, whether she was making a feeble effort to cover them, or cupping them and thrusting them out and upwards to give him a better view. She was barely able to control the excitement in her voice as she said, "You know, Tiger, things have been a bit strange lately. To say the least. I hope you don't mind me being more open, like asking you to help with the shampoo. I figure it can only help you out with your treatment. Are you okay with stuff like that? I'm a bit confused about it, but Suzanne thinks it's the right thing to do. I'm just trying to follow her advice about what's best for you." Then she turned away again. He thought, Jesus H. Christ. I saw a bit of her bush. And a nipple, too. I had no idea Mom is so. Well, just plain hot. He tried to speak, stuttered on air, and then cleared his throat. Yeah. Sure. Thanks, too. I'll be going now. But her hands were now repeatedly sliding over her ass in what looked to be a very sexual way. There was no way he could tear his eyes away from such a sexy sight, even though he was sure he'd come in his shorts in a matter of moments. She thought, this has to stop. I'm acting like some kind of porn star performing a striptease. I'm putting on a private sex show for my very own son. This has to stop, and now. But if it's so wrong, why do I feel so good, so alive? She transferred her weight from one butt cheek to the other, knowing that movement made a very arousing sight for her son. Then, squeezing some shampoo into her hands, she raised both arms in the air and began rubbing the shampoo into her wet hair. She arched her back, a pose that made her look remarkably like she was in the throes of sexual ecstasy. He continued to stand there for another minute or more, losing all track of time. If I were a braver man, I'd reach out and touch her. Maybe ask if she needs help washing her back. But I could never do that. It's just the same as if she were a million miles away from me right now, because there's no way I could ever get up the courage to touch her. I think I'd die of fright, even if she asked me to do it. Especially if she asked me to. Okay, good to hear you're okay with that, she said after another long pause. Bedodem, thanks for the help with the shampoo. I'm all set now, she added after yet more moments passed. Her one-sided conversation continued in slow motion. After more time had passed, Alan finally responded with, "Okay, I'll just be going then. I'll see you later." That was the third time he'd announced he was leaving. He took one last look at his mother, who was naked from head to toe only a few feet in front of him. She still had her back turned to him, but even from the back he could see the sides of her orgasm-inducing tits well enough. He was amazed to realize from what he'd seen just how long, shapely, and toned her legs were. It was all he could do not to whip out his dick and masturbate openly right there in front of her. Many guys would have been driven to aggressiveness or even rape by such a sexy scene, but he literally was overwhelmed even by the idea of touching her. She had her back arched dramatically, and her head was bent back even further, so the water pouring from the shower head hit the top of her head directly and then sent the shampoo behind her and down her back instead of down her face. Had her eyes been open, she would have been staring directly up at the ceiling. Her arms again reached up so she could rub the shampoo into her hair. He found the sight of the musculature around her bare armpits surprisingly captivating. And since her eyes were closed, he felt even more emboldened to stare and try to memorize every last inch of her perfect body. Her butt cheeks were clenched, and much of the shampoo suds were running down her back and onto them. Her legs were slightly spread, but the view through her legs of her pussy was obstructed by a large accumulation of suds between her thighs. She turned the water down, then paused. Suddenly she turned her head and looked over her shoulder down towards his waist, to make sure he wasn't doing anything untoward with his rampant erection. He was merely clenching his hands on the crotch of his shorts, as if trying to prevent his boner from escaping. He also hoped that would somehow help him hold back from climaxing, or at least mask it a bit if he did. She covered her boobs and crotch as she turned, acting as if it was only a problem if he saw her front side. But her tits were so large that her hand stood no chance of covering them completely. She didn't even succeed in completely hiding both her nipples. She gazed at his crotch for far too long to be subtle about it, then looked up into his face. Her face was one of concern, indicating that things had gone too far and that he had to go. It occurred to him that she was trembling. That finally broke his spell long enough for him to turn around and walk away. The shower door was still wide open, as was the door to the bathroom. He walked out of the bathroom in a daze, shaking his head in wonder. He hurried back to his room so he could masturbate to thoughts of his mother, even as he was consumed by guilt for doing so. He also chastised himself severely for being so rude and staring at her for so long. He felt as if he was a pinball being bounced around until he didn't know which way was up. Susan thought to herself, why the heck did I just do that? Why didn't I just tell him to go? Why couldn't I have gotten the shampoo myself in the first place? I'm turning into a complete exhibitionist. And worse. Why does he have to have such a big bulge there? And his bare, manly chest. I'm thinking such sinful thoughts about my own son. I can't. I can't. It's wrong, it's sinful, and it's improper. But her guilt didn't last long after she began thinking about Alan watching her naked in the shower. She imagined him aggressively walking into the shower with her, putting his hands on her shoulders, and then calling her an exhibitionist slut. Then she imagined him pinning her against the shower wall and slamming his powerfully hard erection into her burning cunt. Unconsciously she found herself cleaning her breasts, ass, and crotch very thoroughly with a bar of soap, but she still didn't dare masturbate openly. Masturbating was something she had literally never done in her life and she didn't really even know how to do it. As a result, she ended up feeling very frustrated. After the shower ended she felt tremendous guilt, as she tried to banish the unwanted erotic thoughts completely from her mind. She even cried. Susan went downstairs and called Suzanne to come over. She poured out what she called the whole, sordid, horrible story of what she'd done in the shower. Suzanne was surprised and pleased, especially since Susan was still not revealing her dream of a few nights earlier, or that of the previous night either. Suzanne was careful to show only sympathy and concern. They talked about it for a long time. In the end, Suzanne more or less convinced Susan that she'd performed a noble deed in assisting in her son's medical treatment. If her body felt strange or tingly, that was just an inconsequential and perfectly harmless side effect. Susan was glad to find any excuse to explain away her behavior. She felt a lot better, so much so that only hours after the shower she changed into a more provocative dress than any she'd worn before. This time Suzanne didn't even have to tell her exactly what to wear. Chapter 28 Catherine's Sexy Sleepwear. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Alan was very disturbed that he found himself so turned on by his own mother. He'd tried to take a nap after he'd masturbated but found he couldn't sleep, even though he'd barely slept the night before. Images of Suzanne, and Catherine were filling his head. When he'd woken up in the morning his masturbatory fantasies had involved all three of them, and he'd masturbated to thoughts of them as well after he roused himself from his nap. Visions of them had been dominating his mind throughout the day, almost from the moment that the new policy to sex things up was announced. He got up and paced around and around. What he really wanted to do was talk about all of this with someone, but he felt he couldn't reveal his wicked thoughts to any of those three, because the three people he most closely confided in were the very people he wanted to talk about. He decided that he could talk to his sister about the overall situation, at least in a general way, and get some feedback. He went to her room and knocked on the door. "Hey sis." "Yes," she answered through the door. He waited after hearing this, and hearing nothing more, finally decided to open the door. When he did, the resulting sight gave him quite a shock. Catherine was lying in bed with her satin sheets mostly off, wearing just the skimpiest of nightwear. She cried out, "Alan, I'm nearly naked," as if he needed that pointed out to him. She pulled herself up from the bed, which had the effect of allowing him to see her rack much better. He stood with his mouth agape and face blushing. Sorry. I'll leave." He started to shut the door. "No. Wait," she cried out. He stopped, but didn't turn around. That gave her just enough privacy to make herself more presentable. She continued more calmly. "It looks like you want to talk about something important. This is really no different than if I was wearing a bathing suit, it's just that you surprised me." "What is it?" He reluctantly re-opened the door and tried to look anywhere in the room except at his sister's body. He asked, "What are you doing, dressed like that at this hour?" "Oh, I was just taking a nap." "Oh." He thought that was odd, since she didn't take frequent naps like he did, but he didn't have any reason to doubt her. In fact, she was dressed like that precisely so he could walk in on her. She asked, "What's up?" The first thing that came to his mind was how similar his stumbling into a nearly naked Catherine was to his stumbling into a completely naked Susan only a few hours earlier. So he started with that. "Weird things are happening lately, sis. Earlier I accidentally walked in on Mom taking a shower. But she didn't immediately shoo me away, so I kind of looked at her. Naked. Can you imagine that? Our mom, letting me see her naked. And now I see you like this." He looked at her body again, and saw how she was leaning forward as if in rapt attention, with her big tits nearly spilling out of her bikini-styled top. One shoulder strap was slowly sliding down her arm. He went on, with greater agitation and more difficulty in concentrating, anyway, these things never ever happened before, and now they're suddenly happening all the time. Is it all connected to the new, sexing things up effort? Does that explain it all? Catherine lied, "I dunno. I'm not really sexing things up, I'm just finally wearing the clothes I want to, now that Mom'll let me. Like, look at this nightgown. It's so silky and comfy. If you ran your hand all over it, you'd know just how comfy it is." He fell for that. He imagined himself running his hands over it. Since there wasn't much to it, he would have quickly wound up touching her breasts or pussy. Using the excuse of her comment, she ran her hands all over herself like a femme fatale. She caressed her bare hips and tummy repeatedly. He suddenly found himself wishing there was a way he could adjust his shorts. But he focused instead on the conversation, finally continuing, well, whatever the cause, I'm finding myself very, attracted to you all lately. And distracted. And even aroused sometimes. He shifted nervously on his feet while his face only seemed to get redder. You are, she asked excitedly. She clapped her hands in delight, causing her bikini to nearly slide completely off a boob. Only her nipple, which appeared to be protruding and very hard, stopped it from sliding off. She forced herself to calm her voice, then asked, when you say, you all, does that include me? He winced, and then closed his eyes completely in embarrassment. Of course it includes you. I'm really sorry. But you're just so beautiful. Her heart soared upon hearing that. Seeing that his eyes were closed, she repeatedly punched her fist in the air. But fearing that he'd open his eyes again, she calmed herself down and said, that's cool. I don't mind. In fact, I'm really happy that you're finding so much inspiration. Isn't that great? Soon you'll be back on schedule with doing your thing. Yeah. That's great. I guess, he said not very convincingly. He was conflicted and wanted to talk more, but looking at his sister with her clothes so close to falling off was making any attempt at serious conversation impossible for him. So he gave up the effort. That's all I wanted to say, that things are weird. I'll go now. But she kept talking, trying to keep him in the room. I'm sure you'll get used to it. We're trying to sex things up a little, remember. By the way, how do you like my new pajamas? He looked around for pajamas and then realized she was referring to the silk bikini she was wearing. Wait. I thought you just said you weren't sexing things up. She sat up on the edge of the bed and put herself on display, posing like a model. She even put both hands behind her head, knowing that was a pose which would arouse any guy. Flashing him a sultry look, she said, okay, maybe I am. Just a little. He was relieved that at least she'd finally adjusted her shoulder strap. He took a quick glance at his crotch to make sure his erection wasn't making an obvious bulge. It was, so he had to adjust himself a little bit. Nice, he stammered. Cool. He likes it, she answered as if talking to herself more than him. I bought it yesterday just for you, you know, to help make things sexier. But do you think it's too sexy? You're not just my brother, you're like my best friend too. I don't want you to be all weirded out. He was, all weirded out, but he didn't want her to stop wearing it so he lied. No, it's cool. He hastily added, I gotta go. Thanks for talking. His heart was pounding and his brain was fogging. He felt he had to go before he reached sensory overload. Is that all you wanted to say? Well then, I'm going back to sleep. She immediately dropped her head and closed her eyes. But she added, thanks a lot, bro. He just stood and stared at the vision of loveliness. He couldn't fail to miss that the strap had fallen again, causing one nipple to partially poke out of her bikini pajamas. Dang. I've never seen so much of her chest. That's a nipple, right there. My sister actually has an amazing body hiding under all that clothing. She's pretty stacked too. Then it occurred to him that her thanking him seemed incongruous, so he said, thanks for what? Still lying there with her eyes closed, she mumbled, just thanks for being such a great brother. I don't mind looking sexy for you, 'cause I know you'd never overstep the bounds. I think helping you get hard is going to be a lot of fun. She didn't open her eyes, but she smiled for him. He stared some more, then staggered out of the room. He left feeling even more confused than before. He thought in frustration, great. My cure for getting a hard dot on thinking about my mother is getting a hard dot on thinking about my sister. That's crazy. Back in his room, Alan masturbated twice. He told himself he wouldn't think about his sister while he was doing it, but failed utterly. She was all he could think about, as she had intended. Chapter 29 Dirty Talk. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Suzanne asked, "Hey, have I told you what happened to Sweetie and me when I went to his bedroom the day before yesterday?" Susan replied, "No, you didn't, and I don't know if I want to know. Besides, why are you bringing this up now, of all times?" She had a good point about timing. It was Saturday morning, and Susan and Suzanne were doing their usual daily morning exercises in the plumber basement. But rather than talk before they started, or after they finished, or even during a break in between, Suzanne spoke up while they were right in the middle of their exercise routine. Suzanne shrugged. "I dunno. It just came to my mind." That was a lie. There were a variety of expensive exercise machines in the basement, and Suzanne had waited until Susan was sitting on the one she was on now. One had to ride it much like a bicycle, which meant that Susan's pussy was pressing hard against its narrow seat. Suzanne knew that Susan never masturbated, but in this position it was extremely easy to slide against the seat for an arousing ride. Suzanne continued, "I helped Sweetie get hard and stay hard. I even got to see his penis. Totally exposed, right in front of me." Susan closed her eyes tightly and even put her hands loosely over her ears. "I don't want to know about any of that. I figure it'll only make me have more weird dreams." Then, after a long pause, she asked with great worry, "You didn't, touch it, did you?" "No, of course not." "Good. And don't, please." Suzanne said in a dreamy voice, "I didn't, but boy did I want to." "Susan, his penis is so big. But more than its size, it's just so perfect. You know what I mean. When I see a smooth, thick penis like that, all I want to do is run my fingers all over it. And kiss it. And run my tongue." "Suzanne." Susan cried out in exasperation. "Please. I don't need to hear that." She didn't consciously realize it, but her growing arousal was making her slide back and forth in her seat a little bit, stimulating her clit. Suzanne was on a less arousing machine. She wanted to avoid acting suspiciously with Susan watching. She had carefully positioned herself so that she didn't have a clear view of Susan's privates, so Susan wouldn't worry about her self-stimulation being seen. Suzanne said playfully, "Tell you what. I won't tell you any more about that if you tell me about your dreams. Now you've got 3 nights worth of dreams to catch up on telling me. You know I'm gonna get those dreams out of you eventually, even if I have to tickle them out of you." Susan sighed in defeat. She knew that when Suzanne really wanted something, she didn't stop until she got it. She replied, "Okay, I'll make you a different deal. I'll tell you about the dreams of the past 2 nights, but not the weird dream I had 3 nights ago." Suzanne complained, "But now that's the one I really want to know about the most." "Sorry. But everyone should have some secrets." The dream she didn't want to talk about involved her waking up in bed with Alan. They were both naked, and somehow she knew that they were husband and wife, even though it wasn't mentioned out loud. They had kissed and caressed like a very happily married couple that were still deeply in love. There wasn't much more to the dream than that, but she was petrified about Suzanne having a field day analyzing the Freudian implications if she ever found out. Suzanne knew she could coax the truth about that dream out of Susan eventually, but Susan was her best friend, and she didn't want to make her unhappy, so she said, "Okay, fine. Let's talk about your more recent dreams then." Susan dropped her head in defeat as she recalled those dreams. "Suzanne, it's terrible. My dreams are getting more and more arousing, and more improper. They all seem to involve Tiger and his member." "Well, that's no big deal," Suzanne said encouragingly. "I told you it's all about burning off your sexual energy while you sleep. Think of it like lancing a boil. And I'm sure your dreams can't compare to mine. Why, last night, I had this dream where—" Susan cut her off. "Please. No. Don't tell me. You'll just give me more bad ideas." She buried her face in her hands. What do you mean? Susan spoke through her fingers. Ever since you started talking about blowjobs the other day, they've kind of been on my mind. Last night, and the night before, I was having dreams where I had to help Tiger out with his problem. Doing his thing, Suzanne clarified. Yes. But not only did I help him with my hands, I helped him with my mouth. It's so wrong. So very, very wrong. Without realizing it, she resumed rocking on her arousing seat. But it's just a dream. It's not real life. I know. But I keep thinking about doing it in real life too. Not that I ever would. Never. But he is sinning 6 times a day. Masturbation. What the Bible calls the sin of Onan. I feel bad just letting that happen. But I can't just allow myself to help, or even allow you to do it. It's all too arousing. I mean disturbing. Disturbing. She rocked steadily on her seat, still without being consciously aware of it. Suzanne couldn't help but smirk a little bit at Susan's verbal fumble. She asked, "Okay, it's obvious why you can't help him directly, or why Angel can't help him, but what's wrong with me helping him that way?" Susan finally took her hands from her face and said, "You're his aunt. Okay, I know that technically you're not really his aunt, but the truth is, you are. In fact, you're more than that. You're his second mother in all but name. It wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be proper." Suzanne decided not to press that issue just yet. Instead, she said, "If only we could find someone else. Some other woman. A sexy, beautiful, busty woman who'd take his big erection in her hands and happily stroke it and fondle it, caress it and love it. Run her fingers playfully up and down his thick, strong shaft, like the trunk of a sturdy redwood tree." Yes. Yes. Susan whispered. She was lost in reverie, rocking on her seat, repeatedly stimulating her clit. Suzanne went on, "Of course, she'd have to be naked." Completely naked? Susan asked with trepidation. "But of course. What's wrong with being naked? Doesn't it say in the Bible, and they were both naked, man and woman, and they were not ashamed? I believe that was in Genesis somewhere." Susan furrowed her brow, trying to recall that passage. It definitely sounded familiar to her. "Yes, I believe you're right. So why should we be ashamed? Besides, it's practical to be naked in these situations. After all, his cum could fly anywhere. Absolutely anywhere. You don't want to get your clothes all stained and cummy, do you? I mean, this woman wouldn't, would she? I suppose she wouldn't." Susan was finding it harder and harder to breathe. Suzanne grinned a little bit. And while she'd do that, lovingly stroking and caressing Tiger's big, strong erection, he'd play with her breasts. Her big, round, luscious breasts. His thick trunk would grow even thicker, even longer, even harder. Oh, so hard and full of cum as he toyed with her nipples. Why, he might even kiss her on the lips, if it helped his dick stay firm and throbbing with pleasure. Yes. Susan cried out lustily. But then she caught herself, and said to Suzanne, "What I mean is, yes, I suppose that would be acceptable, if it keeps his member hard." "Oh, it does. Who knows how long it would take, but after what seemed like hours of stroking and loving his erection, maybe even kissing it a little." "No." Susan gasped. She was rocking hard, working on her clit now. "Yes. Just a few kisses, here and there. To show him how much she loves him." "Well, okay. She loves him a whole lot." Suzanne smirked again, because it was ridiculously obvious that Susan was imagining herself as the woman in the story. After kissing it, and licking it, but mostly just stroking it, his big dick would be full to bursting with delicious, life-giving cum. His seed. His sperm. Suddenly it would burst forth, a torrent of semen, of love. His cum. No, his love. Would splatter and splash all over her naked body, even while he kept on fondling her big tits. Her cum-soaked big tits. Yes. Susan panted, but this time it was in an emphatic whisper. It's all too much for the busty mother. She falls to the floor, overwhelmed with orgasmic lust, and yet he stands above her, coming and coming and coming, painting her entire body with his fertile seed. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Suzanne went on, and you'd think that would be all, but no. He's a virile, studly young man, and his big dick is powerful and demanding. I know, I've seen it with my own eyes, as have you. He'll be hard again in no time, if he ever gets soft at all. Which he probably won't. This woman will have to keep on stroking and licking and loving and even sucking on his big fat cock. No. Susan gasped, nearly delirious with arousal and excitement. Yes, Susan, yes. Especially that. Sucking and licking it. All afternoon if necessary, and into the evening too. Mornings, as well. Because 6 times a day is so very, very much. He's handsome and full of cum. He has needs. Big needs, yes, yes, yes. Yes. Susan had a vague notion that she was rocking in her seat, but she tried not to think about it too much. She also knew on some level that she was clutching at her hefty boobs, but she didn't want to think about that either, because if she did, she'd have to stop. Suzanne concluded, so that's what that woman would have to do. And not just once, but every day, day after day after day. I dare say pleasuring his penis and saving him from the sin of masturbation would have to be a big part of her life. Maybe even for years to come. Where on earth could one find a woman like that? That's the question. Susan was so close to a climax that it was like agony for her, and there was a growing wet spot on the front of her green leotard. But she slowly came down off her erotic high since Suzanne was winding down with her passionate story. She finally said, yes. That is the question. Suzanne looked around and acted like she was surprised to realize she was in their exercise room surrounded by machines. Hey, you know what? Let's not worry about that right now. I suppose that counts as one of our breaks. We should get back into rhythm before we cool down too much. Yes, Susan agreed sadly. She would have loved for Suzanne to talk more along those lines, but then she told herself that it was the devil inside her thinking those thoughts. Resolving to be a good, responsible Christian mother, she resumed her exercise routine. When Alan woke that morning, he found another wet spot near his stiff morning wood. Such wet dreams had been happening to him a lot ever since the appointment with Nurse Akami. He recalled part of his dream. It was something about Catherine and Susan dancing naked while Suzanne gave him a blowjob. Akami was there too, dressed in her nurse's scrubs, giving Suzanne advice on how to ensure that the blowjob was sufficiently stimulating. He thought, I'm going crazy. How can they seriously expect me to stay sane with all this sexy stuff, accidental or not, happening around here? The day was uneventful for Alan. He was so weirded out by the back nakedness incidents the night before that he decided to spend the day away from the house to give him some time to think. He spent the whole day at the beach with his friends, Sean and Peter. That evening, he went to the movies with yet another friend. By the end of the day, he felt much more himself, and more at ease. He also found the time to climax 3 times, when he woke up and he went to bed at night, and also when he took a late nap after coming home from the beach. But he did that without help from Suzanne or anyone else. Chapter 30 Tennis. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. As Alan had grown older, especially as a teen, he had concluded that he really wasn't religious, despite the fact that Susan most certainly was. He felt obliged to go to church from time to time to keep her from complaining too much. That Sunday he couldn't wiggle out of attending. Not surprisingly, the entire morning was off limits for any kind of sexual hijinks. But the fun resumed shortly after lunch when Suzanne came over. She carried a tennis racket and was dressed in her tennis clothes. Not surprisingly, she looked absolutely fantastic. Alan was reading the New York Times, which he liked to do each Sunday, but he forgot all about that when he looked up and saw Suzanne standing there. She gave him a saucy grin as she waved her racket through the air. "What do you say, kid? Think you can beat me?" He stood up. "You're on." Alan was a very good tennis player. He was on the high school team. But Suzanne was even better. After all, she'd been playing since before she was Alan's age, so she'd had about 20 years more practice than he'd had. But they were close enough in skill to make it interesting. Alan rushed off to put on appropriate shoes and clothes. After he was dressed and had his tennis racket, he looked for his mother and found her working in the front garden. He let her know where he would be. It seemed there was some unwritten rule that the Pestridge women were always welcome at the Plummer house, although the Plummers seldom went over to the Pestridge house. This was because there was such a fun, loving environment at the Plummer house, but a divided and emotionally tense environment at the Pestridge house. The one exception was the use of the fun stuff in the Pestridge backyard. Both houses had nice pools, but the Pestridge house also had a hot tub and a tennis court. Both families were quite rich, but the tennis court was an obvious sign that the Pestridges were wealthier. The court was down a slope from their house, on a large chunk of mostly tree-covered land that easily could have fit another house as large as the big Pestridge one. Alan and Suzanne walked gaily through the gate in the high fence between the two families' properties. As they walked, Alan said, "Aunt Susie, I guess we haven't had much time lately to just talk in a normal kind of way. Have I made clear just how much I love all the help you've been giving me?" She snickered, thinking about how impossible it would be for any boy his age not to love what she was doing to him. But then she said, "You have. Not so much with words, but when you get excited and your eyes light up, that's all the thanks I need." "Aw. Aunt Susie, you're the best." He leaned into her and pressed their upper arms together, even as they kept walking. He asked, "This is kind of a weird question, but can you tell me where all this is going?" She played dumb. "What do you mean?" "I dunno. Things are getting pretty sexual lately, and the way you're helping me out." "Could things, I dunno." Before he could get his thoughts together, she said, "The answer is no, don't question where things are going, just enjoy the ride, okay? And don't push, or you could mess things up. Now, I've got a challenge for you." "What's that?" "One set. If you win, we'll go straight to your room afterwards and I'll help you look at some more sexy pictures." "Okay," he said brightly. "And what if you win?" She gave him a saucy smile. "Oh, I've got a pretty good feeling you'll win." "Oh, man." He thought, instant boner. Because that was exactly what happened to his penis. They reached the court and started playing tennis. Sure enough, Suzanne made it clear from the start that she was going to let him win. She hit the ball as well as ever, but if he hit a shot where she had to run to get it, she usually just stood there and let him win the point. However, he had a tough time winning just the same. For one thing, he'd had a very stiff erection even before they started to play. It certainly didn't go away when Suzanne took off her warm-up suit, revealing a skimpy light blue tennis outfit that showed off lots of leg and cleavage. That was boner-inspiring enough, but as soon as she bent over to pick up a stray tennis ball, he realized that she also wasn't wearing any panties under her short skirt. Sometimes when she twirled to hit the ball, her skirt would rise up and show him flashes of either her bare ass or her bare pussy. Suzanne loved to tease. But at least she had mercy on him, because they only played one set instead of their usual 2 or 3, and she made sure that he won the set rather quickly. In truth, she was nearly as eager to go back to his room as he was. Back in his room, events unfolded much the same as they had the previous time. The main difference was that they both made even less of a pretense about looking at internet porn. They both sat next to Alan's computer, but they only gave token glances to the computer screen. Meanwhile, Catherine was in her room, just across the hall. She didn't like spending a lot of time there, especially when it was a nice sunny day outside. But she'd been reading on her bed, hoping that Alan and Suzanne would have another one of their sessions. As soon as she heard them enter Alan's room and settle down, she crept into the hallway to eavesdrop some more. This time, she was a bit more prepared. Last time, she'd just put her ear to Alan's door, but now she held a glass against the door and put her ear to that. It made a big difference. Previously, she'd only been able to make out occasional snippets of conversation, but now she could hear almost everything that was said. She heard Alan say, "Oh, Aunt Susie. Sheesh. I can't believe it. Your boobs are just so big." Catherine could almost hear the amusement in Suzanne's voice. "Yeah, but that doesn't even begin to cover it. It's not just the size, it's that they're so perfect. So round, so firm, so natural, so unlike the fake ones in the magazines. And your nipples are just the right size, in the right places. I mean, look at these women on the internet. They can't compare. Seriously. I can't imagine how much Hugh Hefner would pay you to grace the cover of Playboy." "Who, me? At my age?" "Yes, at your age. If anyone out there thinks you're too old, they're mental. The only other woman in the whole wide world as beautiful as you is Mom." Catherine sighed as she heard that. Damn it. Mom and Aunt Susie. How in the hell can I compete with those two? She looked down sadly at her chest. Especially in the boob department. What more can I do? I've got D-dot cups, for God's sake, and it seems like they're less than half the size of theirs. If there was some kind of pill I could take, or food I could eat. If I got pregnant, then my boobs would grow. What a dream come true that would be. Her thoughts were interrupted because she heard Suzanne say, "My lord, sweetie, you're really whacking that thing, aren't you? I can't help it. All you're doing is sitting there, but you're so fucking hot that I can't even stand it. I'm gonna come soon." "No. Don't. Hold out. Take your time and enjoy this." Catherine looked up and down the hallway to make sure the coast was clear. Then she lowered her hand, raised her short skirt, and started playing with her clit. She thought, "Yeah, brother. Take your time. Stroke your big fat cock, give it a good, long wanking. Drive Aunt Susie wild, and then blast your seed all over her sexy body." For the next half hour, the three of them continued like that. Catherine kept on masturbating, and she heard just enough discussion every now and then to be able to figure out what Alan and Suzanne were doing. She was disappointed that Suzanne never appeared to have touched Alan's penis or taken off all her clothes, but it sounded like Alan was having a hell of a great time just the same. It turned out that Alan was right about having to come soon, since he came within 5 minutes of when they'd started. But his penis revived almost immediately, and the next time he lasted the rest of the half hour before coming a second time. After that, he made clear he was wiped out, so Catherine beat a retreat back to her room. She'd managed to come 3 times herself, and she'd hardly made a peep doing so. As was her recent habit, once she recovered she got out her diary and wrote down her impressions of the experience.